As the final rays of sunlight dipped beneath the horizon, the town of Riverstone held its breath. Peggy Thompson stood alone outside Diana's diner, the same place where this fight for the town's soul had truly begun. She looked smaller than ever under the looming shadow of what was coming. But the look in her eyes, calm, unwavering, belonged to a soldier who had stared down death in the skies over Vietnam more times than she could count. From the edge of town, a violent roar rose. Engines. Dozens of them. The last of the Shadow Vipers, what remained of them after the fallout, were coming in hard. And behind them, an even darker threat. For heavy trucks, cartel-stamped, reinforced, and loaded with enough firepower to burn Riverstone off the map. Havoc wasn't hiding anymore. He was leading the charge. Inside the diner, Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the earpiece. "They're not bluffing, Peggy. Thermal scans confirm military-grade ordnance. They're coming to end this. For good." Peggy didn't flinch. "Let them come. It ends tonight." Across the rooftops and alleyways, the Veterans Guard moved into position. Not in chaos, not with panic. With precision. With honor. The people of Riverstone weren't running this time. Business owners took up safe positions in basements and reinforced shelters. Volunteers and veterans worked side by side, directing last-minute defenses. The VA center was lit up like a command post, coordinating what had become a civilian resistance with military discipline. Then darkness. The town's power grid went dead. A second later, flares burst from the rooftops, casting the main street in stark white and red. Spotlight after spotlight ignited from hidden positions, illuminating the Viper's convoy like prey under a hunter's scope. They had walked right into the trap. Havoc stepped down from the lead truck, detonator in hand. The scowl on his face was carved in rage, but underneath it, Peggy saw what he truly was, a desperate man who'd run out of options. "This town never belonged to you," Peggy shouted from the street, stepping forward, her voice booming even without a mic. "You tried to rule with fear. But Riverstone found its spine. You don't get it." Havoc screamed. "I gave this place power. Before me, it was nothing." "No," Peggy said, taking another step. "Before you, it was peaceful. After you, it will heal." From the rooftops, Iron Jack's voice rang out. "Stand down, Havoc. You're surrounded. Federal agents are closing the perimeter. One push of that button, and you'll go down as a coward, not a leader." But Havoc was past reasoning. "I'd rather see it burn," he snarled. That's when the shot rang out. Not from the Veterans Guard, but from inside Havoc's own ranks. Diesel, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him through every twisted turn. He stepped forward, weapon lowered, and looked straight into Havoc's eyes. "I didn't sign up for this," he said. "You lost your way." The detonator dropped from Havoc's hand and clattered onto the pavement. The roar of engines was replaced by silence. One by one, the remaining Vipers stepped back. They laid down their weapons. They raised their hands. And just like that, it was over. Federal agents swept in. The cartel operatives were detained. Mercenaries surrendered without resistance. Riverstone had stood its ground and won. But Peggy wasn't smiling yet. She walked slowly across the cracked pavement and picked up the detonator. "You could have destroyed everything," she whispered to Havoc as agents cuffed him. "But in the end, it was never about destruction. It was about what we built." The next morning, the sun rose over a changed town. The Veterans Guard didn't just disband. They evolved. Their factory became a permanent community center, offering job training, counseling, mentorship programs, and protection contracts that weren't about profit, but principle. Former Vipers, like Snake Tattoo, now going by his real name, James, joined the civilian auxiliary, working alongside the Guard to protect what they once tried to destroy. Marshall, the mercenary commander, now out on parole, returned, this time to help. He brought strategy, structure, and experience. Not as a weapon, but as a servant of peace. And Peggy? She stayed in her booth at Diana's diner, morning after morning. The town didn't crown her. They didn't build a statue. They did something better. They listened. They changed. At the dedication of Riverstone's new memorial, a simple stone inscribed with the words "Strength through unity, peace through purpose," Peggy took the podium one last time. This was never about one phone call or one fight, she said. It was about refusing to give up on each other, even the ones who thought they didn't deserve a second chance. In the crowd stood Iron Jack, Sarah, Diesel, and James. Former enemies, now allies. Children laughed in the distance. Veterans stood proud but no longer armed. As the applause faded, Peggy turned her eyes to the horizon. Quiet. Resilient. Rebuilt. Riverstone had won not through fear, but through forgiveness. And it had all begun with one old woman who refused to be afraid. Weeks passed, then months. But Riverstone didn't forget. The fires were long gone, the streets repaired, and the wounds, though slow to heal, were no longer left unattended. What had once been a fragile, frightened town was now one of the most united places in the state. At the old warehouse once owned by the Shadow Vipers, a new banner now hung: Riverstone Restoration and Renewal Project. Inside, former gang members worked side by side with veterans to build modular homes for displaced families and training programs for young people at risk. It was Sarah Chin who led the transition effort. "If we only fight the fire," she once told Peggy, "we never stop the spark from jumping to the next town. But if we change the conditions, give people purpose, they won't look for war." Iron Jack stayed, too. Though he'd once thought of retiring to Florida, he found that leading men into a better life was a calling that didn't end with age. Under his guidance, the Veterans Guard grew into a statewide organization, part protector, part mentor, part bridge between communities and law enforcement. But it was Peggy who remained the quiet constant. She never ran for office, never sought interviews. She just kept showing up at the community center, the VA, the diner, offering a word of encouragement, a steady gaze, a reminder that no matter how dark the past, a better future was always possible. One morning, a young boy named Eric came into Diana's diner. No older than 10, nervous, clutching a sketchbook to his chest. He walked up to Peggy's booth and said, "My mom says you saved our town. Is that true?" Peggy smiled gently. "I didn't save it, son. I just reminded it what it could be." The boy handed her his drawing. It was a picture of her sitting on the porch, the flag waving behind her, children playing on the sidewalk. On the bottom, in big bold crayon letters, it said, "My hero." Peggy's hand trembled slightly as she took the paper. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." That afternoon, she pinned the drawing on the wall of the community center. It sat beneath the framed photos of her rescue missions in Vietnam and beside a newspaper clipping that read, "Veteran Stand Inspires Town-Wide Turnaround." The next week, another boy brought his drawing. Then another. Then a teenage girl who'd once been on probation asked Peggy to help her apply to nursing school. Then James, the former snake tattoo, started a youth mentorship program in Peggy's name. Before long, they started calling it the Thompson Way. Not just in Riverstone, but in other towns too, places where gangs had threatened to rise, where community had been forgotten, where people had nearly given up hope. But when they studied what Riverstone had done, it always came back to one thing: courage guided by compassion. One autumn morning, nearly a year to the day after that fateful showdown, Peggy stood once more in the town square. This time, it was for her. The town had gathered veterans, former gang members, teachers, children, and families to dedicate a small bronze statue in her likeness. Not of her in a uniform, not holding a weapon, but seated on her porch, surrounded by children. Beneath it were the words, "She showed us we were worth fighting for." Peggy was too humble to speak that day. She simply touched the plaque and nodded once, her voice choked with emotion. But later that night, she sat beside Iron Jack and Sarah, looking out over Riverstone's glowing streetlights. "You know," Jack said, swirling his coffee, "I used to think the only way to fix broken systems was with force. Guns, orders, muscle. But watching what happened here, I think you proved me wrong." "No," Peggy answered softly. "You weren't wrong. We needed strength. We just needed to redefine what strength meant." Sarah looked at them both. "What now?" Peggy stared into the stars. "Now," she said, "we help others do the same." And just like that, a plan was born. A new mission. A program to send teams of veterans and reformed community members to other towns, places still trapped in fear. Not to take over, not to punish, but to rebuild trust where it had been shattered. They called it Operation Lantern, because even the smallest light could chase back the darkest night. And for the rest of her days, Peggy remained its beacon, even as she grew slower, even as her hands grew weaker. Her voice, her story, burned brighter than ever. Because in a world that had so often mistaken silence for safety and cruelty for control, she reminded them of something else. That dignity can be defended without violence. That peace is not weakness. That one phone call, one voice, one unshaken woman can remind an entire town what it truly means to stand together. And in the town of Riverstone, long after the motorcycles quieted, long after the last ashes were swept away, that legacy endured. not carved into granite or memorialized in monuments, but carried in the hands of those who chose, every day, to be better than what they once were, to protect, not control, to lead, not dominate, to listen, not command. And all because one 90-year-old woman refused to be afraid. Not then, not now, not ever.